What I'm sure is happening is that Ukraine, the general staff, has done a very good job of preparation. They're continuing to do this, and I think this attack will have the possibility or maybe the potential to have a devastating effect on Russian forces. I think the Russians are really at the breaking point themselves. Their logistics system, we see constant reports of arguing, and I mean flat-out hatred and rivalry between all the leaders on the Russian side. And if this attack begins to pick up momentum and penetrates dozens of kilometers through Russian defenses, I think it's going to have a psychological effect on other Russian forces as well as in the Kremlin. And so I think the potential for a significant outcome is very real. The sanctions are having an effect. Russian people do not support this fight. They can't say that publicly, obviously, but there's nobody rushing to join the Russian army to join the fight. They absolutely don't want to be a part of it. So there's a lot of training that's been going on in Ukraine as well as back in Germany and in Poland and other places. They are practicing to do this, what we call combined arms tanks, artillery, infantry, mechanized infantry engineers, and would anticipate close air support as well. Now, the Russians are not stupid. They know that this is coming somewhere, so they will attempt to preempt it somehow. They obviously have been putting a lot of effort into their own trenches and obstacles and that sort of thing. But I think the Ukrainians will pick the right time and place when the weather, the trafficability of the road, all the conditions are set so that they can bring up more long-range precision weapons that will enable them to make the Crimean Peninsula untenable. Going after headquarters, going after ammunition storage sites, this is how you defeat masses with precision against those specific targets. That's how you neutralize the advantage, the only advantage that the Russians have. I think there is a lot of speculation perhaps that the West is getting weary or getting tired. I'm not so sure of that. I think most nations, including the United States and Germany and United Kingdom and France, recognize how important this is. And we want to see Ukraine be successful. We want Ukraine to win. So I would not say this is all or nothing. You remember when the HIMARS first arrived on the scene back last summer and immediately began to have effect, hitting Russian ammunition storage, Russian headquarters. And so the Russians then moved outside the range of the 90 kilometers that those rockets were able to reach. So by now, if in fact, Ukraine has received the ground, launched small diameter bombs with that 150-kilometer reach, that means more of the Russian headquarters, artillery storage and transportation networks, those are now going to be in range. And so, with that sort of precision, you really undermine the Russian advantage in mass infantry and mass artillery by taking out the headquarters, taking out the ammunition and making it difficult for them to move. And this is the kind of operation that they'll be doing, I think, for the next couple of months. What we would call shaping the battlefield. The Ukrainian General Staff has done a terrific job protecting information and conserving the forces that they are going to need when they do inevitably launch this counteroffensive. I think the fighting around Bakhmut was very costly, but it also was necessary. The General Staff could see that they were able to stop Russian forces there in Bakhmut and to bleed them out and to cause them to use a lot of resources without Ukraine having to push its own armored forces into Bakhmut. That's what they are going to need when they do launch their own counteroffensive, which I would anticipate would be on a very narrow front to achieve a decisive effect, much like your previous journalist just reported to break the land bridge between Crimea and the rest of Russia. Crimea is the decisive terrain. You could kill every Russian soldier within 200 kilometers of Bakhmut, and that would not change the strategic setting. But if you liberate Crimea, that changes everything. So the counteroffensive will be aimed towards the liberation of Crimea and then the rest of the Donbas. I think that comes later. Well, I think the next 2 or 3 months are going to be very challenging. But at the end of the day, Russia's logistics system only gets weaker, whereas Ukraine's capabilities continue to get better. I just have a sense that things are going to look a lot different and a lot better by the end of spring and summer. The Russians from the beginning overestimated their own ability. They underestimated Ukraine's resolve, and they also miscalculated the willingness of the West to stick together to support Ukraine. So because of that, they entered this. Of course, the war started in 2014, but the special military operation, which began February last year, they entered that without having properly developed the logistical infrastructure, without adequate troops, without adequate resources, and without a proper coherent command structure or operational design. I mean, so they've been trying to recover from the original failures and design ever since, as they go. And so, the way they do that, of course, is by pouring in poorly trained, poorly equipped and poorly led conscripts and mobilized troops into the meat grinder in order to try and at least stabilize and buy some time. That was not the original plan, obviously, but because the original plan was so poorly designed, they've had to use human bodies to buy time. And also, of course, their strategic bombing effort of Ukrainian cities and infrastructure is also part of this to buy enough time for them to recover. I think that on the Ukrainian side, of course, I know that these soldiers have to be exhausted. I mean, this has been going on, the constant pounding, the casualties. But the difference is Ukraine is defending their homeland. I don't think you'd find too many Russian soldiers that actually want to be in Ukraine. But the Ukrainians are defending their home, their families, and they've got 50 nations supporting them. The contact group is meeting again today. Is everything being delivered as fast as we would all want? Of course not. But nonetheless, 50 nations and nobody is supporting Russia except Iran. So I think I'm actually optimistic. And I think if we stick together, if the West sticks together, we could see Crimea, the decisive part of this campaign, being liberated this year in terms of capabilities that Ukraine needs. I think that the West is by and large providing much of that, but not all of that, and not as fast as it should be. It took too long to get to the decision to provide the Leopards, for example. Fortunately, they'll get there probably within the next 2 to 3 months. We'll see a lot of Leopards with trained Ukrainian crews, enough to create at least 2 or 3 battalions. So a full armored brigade with Leopard plus Martyr, plus Bradley plus AML, and all these others, and then the self-propelled artillery that's being provided by several nations. These will make a difference. The hero of the Russian Federation has lost his life in the most critical operation organized by Ukrainian intelligence. Dmitry Lisitsky was found dead in his home. With this, Ukrainian intelligence completely changed the course of the war. With this event, which created great tension in the Russian army, great troubles were revealed. This situation, which has upset the soldiers at the front, has complicated everything. In the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Ukrainian army began to press the Russians one after the other. Many soldiers, both on the front line and behind the front line, are very uncomfortable with the situation in the Ukrainian region. In addition, such behind-the-scenes moves by Ukrainian soldiers have brought the unrest in the army to a whole new level. But this latest operation in particular has made Russian commanders lose sleep. Putin's recent unstable policies have reached a completely different point. That's why many countries have started to take cover against Putin. If this continues, Putin will start making enemies instead of allies, which he already lacks. Putin's threats, especially over nuclear weapons, have driven a wedge between him and other countries. However, many countries have reiterated their opposition to Putin with their support and stance. However, the support given to the Ukrainian army not only in the form of equipment for hot confrontation, but also in the form of training, is of critical importance. In the latest developments, it has been revealed how much superiority the Ukrainian intelligence has over the Russians. But with this latest operation, the Ukrainian army has dealt a very strong blow to the Russians. As the advantages Russia had gained were lost, one by one, it was revealed that even the KGB, which is considered one of the best intelligence agencies in the world, was facing serious problems. At the heart of these problems was the fact that Putin went through a very troubled period during his term in power because of the autocratic rule he has established over Russia in many areas. Both the operations against Ukraine and the formations within the army have been through Putin's men. Because of this, many of Putin's advantages have started to fall into the water. If this continues, Russia will face a huge defeat, thanks to the superiority of the Ukrainian army. But the aim of these latest Ukrainian operations is to strike a blow that will put the Russians completely on the ropes. Before we go into the details of the operation, you can use the Super Thanks button to support our team that works every day to bring you the most real news. The Russian army has been in deep trouble for some time now. While Ukraine's steps are becoming more and more clear due to these problems, the Ukrainian army has decided to take much more strategic steps against the Russian army. One of Ukraine's targets was Russian Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Lysitsky, who had played a very important role in the army for a very long time. The Ukrainian army struck a very hard blow because even the KGB could not see this hard step. After that, many names in the Russian army caused a huge conflict within themselves. If it continues like this, it is estimated that the Russian army will soon be in a very big crisis. But the realization of the operation shocked the whole world. Allegedly, Ukrainian intelligence, as a result of their intensive work, located Russian Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Lysitsky. Then Ukrainian intelligence organized an operation there and neutralized Russian Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Lysitsky. After that, the mayor of this region confirmed the incident while the Russian Defense Ministry remained silent. It is not known exactly how much longer the Russian army will be cornered due to such a great pressure from Ukraine. Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Lysitsky, commander of the 2nd Battalion of the 247th Air Assault Regiment, one of the most important figures in the Ukrainian war, received a Hero of the Russian Federation medal from Putin in 2015. This showed once again how bad Russia is, especially in terms of the military. Due to Putin's inability to protect even one of his most important lieutenant colonels, many names in the Russian army have started to make many breakthroughs within themselves. Groups mobilized within the army started to question Putin's authority. According to known data, Russia is said to be the 2nd largest army in the world, but it is thought that such an army's inability to defeat Ukraine is only due to bad governance. The comments of the war analysts on this issue had a great echo all over the world. According to moralists, Russian troops are becoming increasingly restless as the Ukrainian army has taken a number of critical steps. It is possible to say that the Russian army is literally backed into a corner, as Ukrainian soldiers are frequently winning victories on the battlefield. With this cornered situation, it is estimated that there is a very short time left for the Ukrainian army to walk on the road to victory. After all, support has started to come from all over the world for the Ukrainian army to take steps in many areas. Because of this support, opportunities are being created for the Ukrainian army to expel the Russians from the occupied territories in a very short time. This is the reason for the latest war preparations. The training of Ukrainian army soldiers is almost over. A large number of soldiers have been trained with support from many countries to repel the Russians. With this, the Russian army has not a single trump card left. The Russian troops are also suffering from a huge shortage of equipment to repel counterattacks from Ukraine. Then Russia first entered Ukraine. It prepared as if it could occupy it. And 2 weeks after this invasion attempt, thanks to Ukraine's successful line of resistance, the war has been going on for more than a year, not 2 weeks. It is also possible to report that Ukraine has taken the lead in the war, especially in the latest information. Thanks to this, the Russian army has become unable to take the slightest step against Ukraine. If this continues, Ukrainian soldiers will now deal a huge blow to the Russians, and this will pave the way for Putin and many bureaucrats to face even greater difficulties. Ukrainian soldiers now realize that Putin is backed into a corner because of public pressure and the mobilization of the army. Putin is in no position to make the slightest move. After that, it is not known what the Russians will do because the Ukrainian army is now seriously cornered. In recent days, Russia's breakthrough basin has also fallen into a very big problem. As a result of the loss of ammunition in unsuccessful operations, it is known that the Russians are preparing to withdraw. If this withdrawal continues, Russian troops will no longer be able to take even the slightest combat-related step, but the Ukrainian army has turned this to its advantage and has actually started to improve its own modernist thanks to the vehicles and weapons left behind. Ukrainian soldiers are now mobilized to make the move that will break any pressure from the Russian army. As a result of the Ukrainian army's breakthroughs for some time, the Russians are no longer breathing thanks to their breakthroughs, and they can now suffer great damage even in the slightest movement. As a result of these damages, the vehicles it loses will prepare the ground for the Russian army to face great economic difficulties if things continue in this way. The Ukrainian army will now make a very big final blow and expel the Russian army completely from the territories it occupies. According to war analysts, Ukrainian soldiers are now ahead of the war in every sense. With this transition to the front, the Russian army no longer has even the slightest move left. Thanks to this, Ukrainian soldiers will complete their preparations to become a great regional power after the damage they can inflict on the Russian army. And because of these preparations, the many successes that the Ukrainian army is now achieving will change things completely. The Russian army has lost about 180,000 soldiers since the beginning of the war, and the Ukrainian soldiers have demoralized the Russians with such operations, which has further increased the mobilization in the Russian army. And while calls for Putin's resignation continue, it is not known exactly what Putin will do. The Russians have concentrated almost all their assault units to the north of Bakhmut in an attempt to breach the last Ukrainian line of defense before the weather rapidly deteriorates. The Russians accepted her losses, started brutal fights in the region, while the Ukrainians took this opportunity to hit the Russians from the opposite end. Last time I told you that despite continuous Russian announcements that they had broke in through the next Ukrainian line of defense, the Ukrainians maintained control over all the settlements on the line. I also told you that this Russian claims were largely based on the fact that they were able to launch several assaults through the fields, but temporary crossings of the fields are not the same as a permanent presence in these fields. So there was never any encirclement. 3 days later, the situation did not change much. Russian sources continue announcing every day that Berezivka and Yani were captured, while based on the geolocated footage, the Ukrainians are still holding the ground. Nonetheless, the Russians did achieve incremental progress. First of all, the Russians launched an attack along the rails in the direction of Yagodny, and by leveraging densely located visual obstacles, they managed to enter the northern part of Yadin. The Russians immediately doubled down on their attack and tried to push the Ukrainians further south. Their attack was partially successful. They managed to take control of the farmland but later got stuck. If you look at the topographic map, we can see that they are attacking from the lowlands, even though dense rebuilt areas help them to alleviate this problem. At the beginning, when they were entering the village, moving further was not possible without facing this problem. What is more, the Ukrainians are controlling a fortified area right above Yagodny. So the Ukrainians reinforced this group, conducted a counterattack, and pushed the Russians back to the northern part of the village. Some Russian sources reported that the Ukrainians have 2 fortifications that prevent the Russians from accessing the northern part of Bakhmut. And these fortifications are indeed in and around the train station. When it comes to Bajika, the most intense clashes took place in the small forest northeast of the settlement. Over the last 3 days, the Russians managed to breach Ukrainian trenches along the highway, which opened access to the local heights. And from there they were able to assault large fortified side of the forest and establish control over it. This automatically means that the Ukrainians withdrew from the buildings located next to the forest, while the Russians did not enter them because they are in an open field. So half of the settlement is in the gray zone. The head of the Wagner forces, Prigozhin, said that Baraka would likely fall in a few days, but as you remember, several days is all the Ukrainians need. The weather forecast says that in 2 days the temperatures will turn positive, melt all the snow, and there will also be rain. Assaulting through the fields will quickly become impossible, which means that the Russians may need to stop when it comes to other settlements such as Dubova, Vasilivka, and Dorhovo. Vasilivka, no changes have been recorded here because it seems like the Russians are really concentrating on Gatchina and Borovika, but this comes at a cost to their progress south of Bakhmut. Here the Ukrainians have reportedly taken advantage of the temporary weakness in the Russian flank and conducted another counterattack. If during the previous counterattack, the Ukrainians recaptured the hills, then during this counterattack, they drove the Russians further from the hills. In the meantime, the head of the Wagner forces, Prigozhin, continues blaming the Russian Ministry of Defense for undersupplying them with the necessary ammunition. Overall, Wagner forces concentrated their assault units to the north of Bakhmut in an attempt to bridge the last remaining defense line on their way to cut off the Crimea road. Nonetheless, their progress continues to be slow, partly due to the internal politics of the Russian army, and even though they might manage to take Bahuka, they will almost certainly not be able to breach Ukrainian defense in Yagodny, and with deteriorating weather conditions, the intensity of the fights here may rapidly decrease and give everyone a break.